Okay. Well, hello there, healthcare humans. Thanks for coming back for another episode, a very special episode of The Other Human in the Room, because it's also a special episode of
Ending
physician,
Physician Overwhelm.
Ending Physician Overwhelm, which, like, those things are related. Totally. So we thought we'd introduce ourselves as two physician coaches who have podcasts and then kind of just have a conversation. So, Megan, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm Dr. Megan Melo. I'm board certified in family and obesity medicine, and I practice in Seattle, Washington. And I'm also a certified life coach through the Life Coach School, and I coach physicians primarily on issues around burnout, people pleasing, perfectionism, boundary issues, all of those things that I really think are sort of habits that get wound up into us and cause a lot of problems for us. I also am a certified Daring Way facilitator. And so I lead people through the work of Brené Brown, which has been just very impactful for me, really sort of getting into vulnerability and shame resilience and, some of those fun issues. And in my personal life, I live in Seattle, Washington with my husband and my two sons.
I
And
love
let's
that.
hear about you.
Yes. Hi, I'm Dr. Joan Chan. I also practice family medicine up in Guelph, Ontario, Canada. And I call myself a restorative medical educator and coach. Because I really like both the education piece and like teaching as well as the coaching. And probably the best coaching is teaching and the best teaching is coaching. So it's a bit of like a combo. Um, and the thing I say is that I help humans in healthcare to try and make their experience of healthcare feel more human. Because the thing that I have learned the most from this world of coaching, also certified at Life Coach School, and also done some other certifications, and really the process of like coming home to yourself as a human being, and in the process recognizing how dehumanized we have been,
Mhm.
like maybe just like in the world, socialized
Mhm.
female, certainly like a couple of our
Certainly.
identities
Yeah.
dehumanizing,
Yeah.
but certainly in medical training, that being
Yeah.
a real time of just needing to set aside all your bodily and emotional and spiritual human needs, and that then the medical culture continues on to reinforce that, to sort of put yourself last, pretend you don't have a human body, pretend you don't have an emotional well yourself, and so that's why I like calling it restorative education and coaching, because I think
Yeah.
something was really lost, and that's something that I have found personally, like in my own life, that coaching and learning from teachers like Brene Brown. So I love you're certified through her, like folks like that who are interested in being like, can we all just name that?
Can we just,
I don't
yeah,
like
get
it's
back to
not
being
supposed to be
human?
this hard. Yeah, can we just get back to being human? Like, I think this shouldn't be this hard, you know?
Yeah.
So,
No, I love
yeah.
that. And it's funny, the restorative part. Yeah. Because I often talk with people about like, we need to unlearn what we learned, right?
Yes.
Because what we learned got us here,
Yeah.
right? It got us to be physicians. It got us into medical school. It got us all these things, right? It had its purpose. And now it's too much, right? It
Yeah.
is dehumanizing. It has taken us away from being connected to our body and who the heck are we anymore, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wonder, like, for you, how that experience has been, especially like when did you start noticing, like, God, whether you framed it as like I'm being dehumanized, but like
Yeah.
how's it been being a human in healthcare these past few years, and what brought you to the
Oof.
coaching world?
Yeah. Um, it's been an off and on struggle for me, really since pretty early in my attending career. I felt, during residency, it's like, yeah, just bring it on. I'll just pile as much stuff as I can on here, right? And got out into the quote unquote real world as an attending and was just like, oh my gosh, there's just too much stuff. There's too much pressure. There's too much work all the time. And I didn't really know how to cope with it. And so, some up and down experiences with burnout, quite frankly. And, had a couple of kids, early on. I started teaching in a residency program. And I was doing sort of literature searches on physician well-being and physician resilience and wellness, and, trying to really figure out, like, how can I make this better? Because this feels really hard.
Yeah.
And kind of all the people I turned to, who frankly were mostly men, were kind of like, I don't know, this is just kind of how it was. And a lot of the women that I saw were really burned out, really struggling, but wouldn't always talk about really any of it. And you get to start thinking, like, am I broken? Is there something wrong with me, that I don't like this, that I don't think it's okay? But each time I'd kind of crank myself up harder and be like, you just need to work harder. You just need to forget those human parts even more,
Yep.
if that's possible, right? And sort of, again, sort of went through periods of this, and in starting about 2019, like, really started to be so crispy that my attitude was starting to be a problem, and I was starting to get called out on it. Like, great patient interactions, but I had nothing left in the tank for staff that I worked with. I was really upset and cranky at meetings and complaining a lot. And unfortunately, the response to that was just to sort of be in trouble, right? To
Mm,
be sort of labeled a difficult person.
mm.
At one point in 2020, good, I don't know, 5 or 6 months into the pandemic, yeah, I got sat down with HR, and they were like, you really need to fix your attitude problem, and they should, put a pretty picture. It literally said, put a pretty picture on your desk, which
Oh,
I
why
didn't
didn't you
actually
think
have a
of
desk
that?
anymore,
Oh no.
because of COVID. Like, I didn't actually have, like, I was just like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, and like, that same week, I happened to have a medical appointment, for my human body, and with somebody I didn't know, and it was a vascular surgeon, varicose veins, and just like, found out as a doctor, and she's like, "How are you?" And I just burst into tears. I just lost it,
Mhm.
and I was just like, I can't do this anymore.
Mhm.
And my coping was to ultimately, like, secretly get board certified in obesity medicine. I didn't tell anybody what I was doing. It's like, this will be my out. I have to have a thing to do to leave. And I got my board certification. I put in my notice, and I just was like, you know what? I can't move on to anything else
Yes.
feeling this way.
Mm.
And I happened to stumble across a physician coach who was doing like a webinar, and I went, and somebody else who's life coach school trained like we are. And the thought model that she presented just made so much sense. It was like light bulbs went on. I was just like, oh, that's stuff that people have never said out loud to me before, that my thoughts create my feelings drive my actions. That's why everything is so hard.
Mm. Mhm.
And ultimately, joined her program, ended up becoming a coach, and so it's been sort of a process through that. I did leave that job, but I eventually returned to medicine, and really have come to it from such a different place,
Yeah.
and it's made such a huge difference for me.
Mm. I love that.
Tell me your story, because I always start my guest interviews, really kind of hearing about, how did you get here to this place where you're a practicing physician and you're a coach? What was your experience like?
Yeah. And I think I love the name of your podcast, that it's just names that overwhelm. Because I just think, for me, if I look back, like, I I think I almost wouldn't have called it burnout, though it also kind of was, but it was more overwhelm.
Hmm.
I Since the beginning, since even medical training, and but certainly coming out into practice, I remember posting, I think it was within my first year of like having my own practice. I
Hmm.
do outpatient family medicine, and I posted on some like Facebook grouping like, does anyone have like resources or would be interested in like a support group? Because this like seems impossibly hard and no one's talking
How are we
about
supposed to do this?
yes. And so pretty early on, like a couple other people were like, yes. And so we like formed a little support group. And that was so fabulous just for that peer connection and
Mhm.
and really useful. And, you know, the demands of a growing practice plus then adding in, yeah, I have two boys as well, 5 and 3. So like going through that. And then for me, like I think a lot of people in the world and especially like physicians and other clinicians, like the pandemic, I was halfway through my second pregnancy, March
Mm,
2020, and um talk about overwhelm,
right?
and
Plus
like
hormones.
plus hormones, plus like just, and it was kind
Oh,
of
so
interesting. Like
much
that
fear.
first year was like, it almost was like galvanizing in a way where it was like, I was like, I had a singular focus, which was like try and prevent COVID from entering my house and like hyper focus on the pandemic. So
Yeah.
that first year felt super intense, but like pure survival mode, and in some
Mhm.
ways slightly empowering, set some
Yeah.
boundaries with family that I hadn't before. So
Mhm.
like there were some gifts in there, but then especially like returning to family medicine in like January 2021, and the coping mechanism I had, because it was like the world is burning, everything's helpless. We're in our like 50 billionth lockdown already. The vaccines just come out.
Yeah.
Like I'm trying to like outrun my feelings. So obviously I'm going to become the MD lead of our local vaccine clinic. And as well as had already joined during my mat leave, I was like in Zoom meetings breastfeeding from home because you couldn't go anywhere,
Right,
for
right.
like our local anti-oppression advisory team, because systemic racism was finally being talked about, which is good.
Yeah.
But like so many committees, plus clinical work, plus a 6-month-old and a 3-year-old. Um, and obviously that wasn't sustainable. I rode that wave for a while, but there was a
Yeah.
moment, it was like in the middle of that summer, and things had taken a bit of a turn. I part of it was so hard, was like one of the kind of my things I was focusing on was like, I can't get my babies vaccinated, but I can vaccinate everyone around me. That was kind of like my one of
Mm,
the things I was like
yeah.
super focused
Yeah.
on. And that summer, I don't know if it depends what job you were having that time, but
Mm.
where we were, the only people who hadn't yet gotten vaccinated were people who really weren't going to.
Yes.
And it was leading to a lot of tough conversations and a
Yes.
lot of socialized, internalized guilt and shame, that
Mhm.
apparently it was my job to push these people across the finish line, when
Right.
that really wasn't even an alignment of my values, because I've always been like, you're in charge of your life and I'm
You're an
here to
adult.
support.
You get
Yes,
to decide. Here's the
there's
information.
the information, and
Yeah.
yet I felt like there's, it's like, here's how to convince them, and just noticing my rising resentment, and
Yeah.
some of it was like, honestly, like some of what people said was just like pretty harsh to
Yeah.
hear. And it was, I understand it was from the stories they needed to tell themselves, and it's all, but like at the moment, like just getting kind of the waves of that, and starting to feel for the first time pretty like angry at some of my patients, and just resentful. Like there was a moment when someone came in and they're like, oh, by the way, at the end of our 20-minute appointment that was supposed to be 10 minutes,
Right, right.
and they're like, my knee also has started hurting. And I wasn't just resentful of the person, I was resentful of their knee. I was like, seriously,
How
knee?
dare you?
How dare you? Why can't one body in this
Yeah.
place not
Yeah.
fall apart? Because I can't do it. Like, and I
I
realized like,
can't handle your knee.
I can't handle your knee.
Yeah.
And I'd kind of, I think I'd heard about different kinds of coaching, but like the one that then I was like, I need to do something. And I'd heard about Sarah Smith's Charting Champions course, where she also
Mhm.
trained at the same school as us. And
Mhm.
her program was like a perfect gateway into coaching, because it had this very
Yeah.
specific purpose. And I was like charting all day. My inbox was overflowing, like all the things. And so it's like, I can get this one thing under control. And through that, then discovering just the wider world of coaching and some of the concepts that like are just so powerful to explore, like concepts about emotions and how they aren't there to kill you. They are there to help you and protect you. And maybe it's only totally okay to feel them all the way through, including
Yeah.
overwhelm. Like actually for me at this point, like when I think of overwhelm, really it's often because my body is firing multiple emotions at once. And
Mhm.
that's actually all that's happening. And that's maybe, I don't want to minimize it because it feels terrible when you're in it, but like
Yeah.
actually then if you're unafraid of addressing those emotions one at a time, it's okay. You haven't fixed the world, but that
Yeah.
actually the world's gonna be the world. That's like the
Right.
thing I've learned through coaching is the world. I didn't make no illusions. I'm not one of the, I'm not like everything's actually fine. Like things are not fine
Things are
pretty
not fine.
clearly,
Yeah.
objectively. And I do have control over how I take care of myself, how I treat myself.
Mhm.
Can I be a friend to myself and to my body and really center my humanity? And in doing so, there's nothing that can chronically overwhelm me. And if I feel temporarily overwhelmed, just being a human, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that's often how I tell like the beginning of my story, just because I think a lot of people, especially, those who go into healthcare, those who are like high achievers, like we try and outrun our feelings and we try and outrun like the sinking. I think it was just the sinking feeling of this world's not okay. And I
Yeah.
need to, and I can only do so much. And I
Yeah.
really maxed out my capacity. And it was impressive what that max was. But I am no longer interested in doing that. I'm interested
Yeah.
in, like I said something earlier this year, and I've kind of had a little mantra of like, what if I designed my life, including clinical life, etc., to be at like maybe 75% of my capacity, like
Mm.
intentionally
Mhm.
designing my life to be under what I am capable of doing.
Yeah.
That almost sounds like kind of rude.
Whoa.
I'm actually like interested in what you think because I saw it said like recovering perfectionist. Like that, I'm sorry if I've offended anyone listening by saying that, but it's like kind of when you think about like, I don't know, a machine or any kind of system, you're kind of you want that machine to have some buffer so
Mhm.
that when something happens, it's not already at its max.
Yeah. It needs to have, some break time. Like
Yes.
if we run at full capacity 24 hours a day,
Yeah.
it's going to wear out.
Gonna wear out.
Yeah.
It's not actually designed for that. And even if it
Right.
was designed for it, where there was no, say this was like a machine and there was no resistance and no whatever,
Yeah.
then what happens when the next thing comes and you're
Right.
already at your capacity because the next
Right.
thing's always going to come.
It's
We
always
need
going to
to
come.
leave
Yeah.
space. And
Yeah.
so that's felt like honestly at times these past few years, like sort of practically speaking, like maybe cutting back on hours, saying only taking on so much in a certain
Mhm.
clinical encounter, offering patients opportunities to take control of their own care in ways, that
Yeah.
have, I think, been empowering for them and for me. And sometimes I'm like, this feels illegal. Like it feels like I feel like one of my sort
It
of
feels naughty,
thoughts,
doesn't it? Right?
it's like
Like,
I think
ooh,
I'm gonna get in trouble because I only
yeah.
wrote so many lines in my note and I didn't write every single thing or whatever, right? Like you think
Yeah.
that you're gonna get in
Yeah.
trouble.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to one thing that you were talking about when, kind of feeling this pressure to get people vaccinated.
Ah,
And
yes.
I'm curious for you too, because I was in a big system before and we'd have all these metrics in front of us all the time of like, how you're doing with patients with diabetes and, their A1C numbers and their colon cancer screening rates, kind of all these things that we're supposed to get to a certain number. And I remember, especially early on in training and persisted, of having that pressure of like, oh, it's my job to convince these people
Yeah.
and somehow manipulate them into, frankly, kind of
Yes.
believing that they need to do things a certain way, into always taking their medications or at least always picking them up as though they're taking their medications so the metrics work or
Oh,
any number of things. And it's just like we don't actually control what other adults do. Again, we're there to advise, diagnose, prescribe. Like we've got a role, right? But I think one thing that coaching brought to me was really being aware of like I don't actually control what happens when they leave the room. I love what Sarah Smith said on one of her podcast episodes. She's like, it's not any of my business what my patients do
mhm.
once they leave the clinic.
Yes.
right? It's not my business whether they're taking their medications or whether they're doing this or that, because I don't hold that, right? Like I'm not responsible for that. But our systems absolutely benefit from us continuing to believe that we should be able to manage those things, and that we can.
Yes.
Right.
And like the end of that is they think they're benefiting, and probably in the short term, whatever metrics they think are important, they are.
Mhm.
But I think if you look at how people are either quiet quitting or just full on quitting,
Right.
I don't think it's working out so well for these
Right.
folks.
Yeah.
Maybe that's where like I had this moment where I had to kind of like go through a grief process because it didn't have like when the pandemic happened and it's like everything blew out sideways.
Yeah.
One thing I was like, maybe we'll actually say, look, we can change things. Look, the old ways are like literally gone.
Yeah.
So how do we want to move forward? Look
How do
at
we want to
these
rebuild this?
humans. Yes. And
Yeah.
then I'm hopeful some places they did really look and say, gosh, all we have is each other. What if we actually do this together? And you know what? I do feel like in my clinic, my little corner of the healthcare system, which is the system I have the most direct influence over, me and five other docs and, doing our own thing.
Mhm.
I can see that. It's not perfect for sure, but like even narrowing down to myself and my little ecosystem in there, like I think that I can have influence there and we have bonded through the pandemic in ways that I think can serve us.
Mhm.
But when you look at the system as a whole, like not everyone learned that lesson,
Oh,
sadly.
yeah.
And the whole notion that like if someone's A1C, for example, like I think we just have to zoom all the way out at like what are we even doing with things like targets and things like
Mhm.
and especially in any kind of way individualizing so that we're viewing them like a report card so that a physician would say I'm failing because only blah blah percent of my patients have A1Cs do like that is speaking of even equity, thinking
Mhm.
about the populations, whether it's ethnicity or socioeconomic status, who are because of no fault of their own, but
Yeah.
either genetics and also environment are
Yeah.
going to just naturally mean they are much higher risk of much higher A1Cs. Why who's this helping? How is this
Yeah.
not going to end up being punitive or people starting
Right.
to prune their panel? I don't even know what happens when people feel that pressure, right? And like, is any of that medicine? Is any of that caring for people?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's
And
heartbreaking.
and it's not only dehumanizing to us, right? Of trying to make us believe that we're responsible for that, but it's also reducing our patients to numbers. And not to say, right? I don't think either you or I would say, well, we don't want our patients to have, good blood sugar control or,
Yeah.
a healthy blood pressure, right? Because of course we do.
Yeah.
But at what cost, right? And with
Yes.
with what resources are we providing them,
Yes.
right? Because our patients are not numbers either, right? They are the other human in the room besides us.
Yes. Sometimes we actually have to remember that like literally
We're
there's two
both
humans.
humans.
And like, because like what gets in the way is like all the stories they might be telling about themselves or about, speaking of Brene Brown, I just love how
Yeah,
she says that, and about us. And then there's all the
yeah,
stories we're telling about them and ourselves and all like, I almost think like it's like there can be boogeymans in the room. You almost feel them like the medical legal
yeah,
team, the college they could complain to, the colleague who's always very judgmental and is up to date on the guidelines when you're not. And you like feel them like this pressure in
yeah,
the room, like,
yeah,
I want to just say it's fine, but apparently
yeah.
I'm supposed to
Supposed to say this.
say this. And it just feels, you can just feel how inauthentic it feels. You feel
Yeah,
how you see the patient's shoulders droop. And then like, no wonder we're burnt out at the end of the day.
yeah,
Like, what if we put that aside? Like, that's one way I really think about like the power we have as the people who have the actual medical training, who are doing the actual work with the actual other humans. If we collectively decide like, it's cute you keep bringing us these numbers. Thank you for the information. Like as if they're bringing us the
yeah,
weather. Like if
yeah.
someone's like, it's cold today, or you're like, oh, it's my fault. So it's the
Oh,
same thing. Here's the weather. of some
Yeah.
random facts about our patients. Interesting. And then we go right back to doing what we do. My hypothesis is in the long run, any influence I could possibly have to maybe empower or help shift or whatever, if I put those metrics aside, I actually have the best chance of maybe influencing a couple of those people's metrics anyway.
Mhm.
Like we need
Yeah.
to set down those things because
And much
otherwise it's like,
more so, right,
yes,
than, yeah, constantly sort of hitting them with, look, you're not taking that. You should be doing this. You should be doing that. Like, that's not building trust. That's
no,
not going to bring them into the medical community.
no,
Um, Thinking about that, yeah, we're getting back to Brene Brown, thinking about
yeah,
the role of shaming, right?
yes,
I don't think that any of us were ever probably overtly taught to shame
no.
our patients, but covertly, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
right? And that doesn't work with our kids,
No,
doesn't work with our patients, right? It just creates more heartache, right? More trauma to us, more trauma to them, yeah.
yeah. I think that's like, and I think it's sort of this like chain of shaming, right? Like it's just that
Yeah.
shame begets shame.
Right,
And
right, because then we
so,
get shamed for not having the metrics,
yes,
or it went the other direction. We're shamed for not having the metrics, so
yep,
we then shame our patients.
totally.
Yeah.
But so I'm curious, like, especially having done sort of deeper work around Brene, like, did that just make you see shame everywhere? Like I think so much about, I sometimes call it like the shame-based medical culture or the hidden curriculum.
Mhm.
When you kind of think about that, like what what comes up for you when you view like the role of shame in some of the harder parts of our medical culture?
Yeah, I think for me, I probably didn't see, I mean, I probably didn't think about it too much in terms of patients, a little bit, but I could recognize like, oh, here's an episode where shame has been used, and
Mm,
um as a woman, right, I would often receive patients who had kind of left a previous doctor and maybe experienced shame, and shared their story, and trying to validate them in that moment. But I think where I really paid a lot of attention to it, where it was really striking to me, was seeing how often shame had been used to keep us in a box, right? I think about, the way that our training is, right? It's very shame focused in the way that perfectionism is really about shame avoidance, right? Shame as a, this is, again, sort of Brene teaching, shame is a universally painful human emotion. It's normal. Animals experience it as well.
mm,
We all don't like the feeling of it. It makes us all want to run and hide and play small and stay safe, right?
mm,
That's just a natural reaction to it. But I think about how often our training really drilled into us to avoid shame at all cost. And the consequence of that was, developing these habits of intense perfectionism if we didn't already have it. And really this hypervigilance that in and of
mm,
itself is traumatic, right? People talk about not being able to relax, not being able, like maybe they had vacation and they were really looking forward to it. And the whole time, they kept scanning their inbox in case somebody missed something, or they were catching up on all the work because they couldn't get it done. I remember having residents who would always be looking at the labor and delivery board online before they came to their shifts, or, checking the patient roster, to see,
mm.
what was coming for them. And it's all an attempt to minimize shame and overwhelm, right? To try and be in control of everything. And it's caused so much harm to us. And we got so good at doing it to ourselves. That's the really great part, if you will, air quotes here. About our medical training, right? We're high achievers. We were taught to avoid shame, right? Think about being pimped on rounds, right? And
Mm.
not knowing an answer, right? We're never going to not know the answer again. Um, that training really built into us this deep and intense and often traumatizing fear of shame,
Yes.
fear of not knowing, fear of being wrong, fear of missing something. And we are humans. We make mistakes, we
Yeah.
get distracted, we try as much as we can to minimize all those things, but this wound up so tight in sort of avoiding shame and fear and overwhelm makes it so much harder to be mindful and present and to not make mistakes. Actually, it probably creates more mistakes, right?
Absolutely.
Um, yeah, so I couldn't unsee all those elements of how our training had done that to us. I couldn't unsee, and I did the Brene training mostly before I'd made the decision to leave. Most of it was completed before, but I kind of couldn't unsee the environment I was in and
Yeah.
how I would say it at the time, how I was being made to feel,
Yeah.
right? Because I didn't yet have the idea that my thoughts create my feelings, and I had 100% adapted these thoughts from the training that I had received of this is how I have to do things. I have to watch for these things. I have to do this. I have to try and control. I have to try and get my patients, on board with the plan with all their right medicines and, get their A1C down. Um, and that was it was a hard realization of
Yeah.
how much shame was kind of just baked into everything around me.
Yeah. It's a painful realization. You understand why some don't want to see it or
Yeah.
defend it
It's
or
easier to keep my head down. It's easier to keep up
totally.
hustling, right?
Yes. It's sort of like I think sometimes that's like almost why you internalize it. It's like, no, it must be me. Because if the
Yeah.
truth is like, oh no, like our whole system, and it's not the entire system, and it's not to throw out all the humans in it, but certainly like a lot of how this whole thing was structured and designed and operates
Mhm.
is on some really painful, traumatizing stories.
Yeah.
And it's easier for a while to be like, maybe I can just win the game. Maybe the
Right.
game is
Maybe
winnable.
I'll find the answer and I'll be better than everybody else that
Yes.
I've seen suffering and miserable or
Yeah.
overusing alcohol or food or, any of the
Yes.
millions of ways that people cope. I
Yes.
remember sort of looking around and sort of hearing people talk and thinking, is everybody just having a bunch of wine every night? Is that what we're doing? That doesn't seem right to me.
Right. You're like, is that seriously the only way?
Not
Like all the
I don't
things.
like wine. What am
Oh no, I'm screwed. I gotta find something else. Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
true. And like I think I think the good thing to know is, and I think what coaching really allows you to do is, yeah, like basically take back ownership of your thoughts, take back
Mhm,
ownership of the stories you choose to tell yourself.
mhm.
And it's not to say that those other stories aren't in the air you're breathing, and it's not that they're
Yeah,
not there all day. So
yeah,
it's, yeah, that's still there.
yeah.
And
And they
it's
they
still
still come
optional.
back to me,
Oh, they still come
Oh,
back.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
like when you've been thinking them and hearing them for decades, like they're there. But then there's this moment, maybe after you've spun for a bit, or I don't know about you, but over time, as I've been doing more of this, I can catch it a bit quicker. Where I'm
Mhm.
like, there you are.
There we
I know
are.
what you do, and this is the story I choose to
Yeah,
tell about myself and my inherent goodness. This is where I'm going to anchor myself because,
yeah,
frankly, it feels better.
yeah.
And I have no reason to believe it's not truer, honestly.
Right? We actually get a choice, yeah,
Yes.
realizing I can I can shape the way that I think, right?
Yes.
I can't change every thought that comes to me. I can't prevent some of those painful thoughts from coming through,
Yeah.
but I can choose to notice them, learn to notice them and tune them in and say, "No, remember, that's not the story that we're running with anymore.
Yeah.
Turns out I'm worthy right now.
Yep.
I'm responsible for my parts, but not
Mhm.
for everybody else. And I'm doing the best that I can.
Yeah.
And some days are easier than others."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit, because we've already used the word a bunch, but I've heard you speak on your podcast about trauma and painful experiences. And I don't think that we've talked generally enough in the medical community
Mhm.
about mostly little t traumas that we have experienced through training. Certainly, there are big T traumas that have happened. Let's not deny that, right? Assaults, abuse, harassment, like those things have definitely happened. But we don't talk enough about the little t traumas, right? Being yelled at or belittled, being told that you have to make something work even though you don't know how to do it, or you don't have the proper equipment, or you're not trained for it. And I heard you share a story, and if you don't mind sharing it again,
Yeah.
of sort of realizing an experience during residency that really impacted you.
Yes, I would love to. I think the thing that was really helpful for me to learn about trauma, because I think the way that trauma was sort of taught to me or generally spoken about was like it's PTSD, and it is sort of the
Soldiers.
the big
Yep.
soldiers and then
Yep.
like assault victims, and like
Yep.
in school it
Yep.
was sort of focused on sexual trauma, which I mean is an important component, and
Yep.
like being sensitive to it, and almost like but don't talk about it because it might trigger them, and so then it becomes like
Need to find out if someone
stigmatizing
has
it
been
more.
assaulted, but they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, it was very confusing, and
Yeah.
then made it seemed actually more like don't go there, which I'm sure wasn't the intention, but
Yeah.
it's not their desired effect. So then and this was even post training, like learning that there were big and little t traumas, that there were the kind of weathering things that even, yeah, being just socialized female in a patriarchal society, being a
Mm-hmm.
visible minority in a
Mm-hmm.
white supremacist society, like all these different things that even those and the microaggressions that come can have a over time cumulative effect. And I have a hypothesis that at least many of us who went through medical training would describe just the experience of going through that time and sort of the shame devices that are used and exploited, that ends up being its own weathering of, and that's the
Yeah.
dehumanization in a way is saying
Yeah.
traumatizing, right?
Yeah.
And the thing that helped even crystallize it further is like that if something lives in you as a trauma, like because the notion is if you have something in your body and you're overreacting, I'm putting that in
Mm-hmm.
quotes, to some current event that seems benign,
Yeah.
you know, it's likely because it's reminding you of a past event. And so what decides to live in your body and does your nervous system get overprotective of?
Mm-hmm.
It's times where something alarming or hurtful happened to you. And then in the aftermath, you are left feeling helpless, so like
Mm-hmm.
out of control,
Mm-hmm.
and alone, so
Mm-hmm.
disconnected.
Yeah.
And man, helpless and alone describes a
Yeah.
lot of what I felt on those words, especially I would say in clerkship as a medical student. And the story that I'd shared, I was sharing it in the like framing around people pleasing, which
Mm-hmm.
is a concept that I really resonated with when I first heard. And then digging into it further, thinking about how often what we call people pleasing is actually a trauma response. There's like the classical trauma responses of like fight, flight, freeze, but there's this fourth one, fawn, FAWN, which is like, and this is again animals, like
Mm-hmm.
everyone actually can use this as a safety mechanism in their nervous system of if you're presented with a threat and you think you can't take them in a fight, you're not fast enough to run away from them, playing dead doesn't seem like a good idea. Instead you kind of go, nice
Yeah.
kitty, or you say
Yeah.
soothing,
Yeah.
pleasant things that you think the predator needs to
You're not
hear.
rocking the boat,
I
right?
am here to please you so
Yeah.
that I survive. And really connecting that, it made me look back on this event in my medical training in a whole new way, because the short version of it is I was in a setting with an older male preceptor in like at the start of like it was going to be like a cardiac surgery, like a long surgery. I had already had some experiences with this preceptor where he had sort of outright said to me he didn't think I was a very good learner. And this was a preceptor in a rotation that was very important to me. It was the specialty I wanted to get into. And now we're in this OR setting, and he's like, hey, do you want to put in this catheter? I have never put in a catheter before. I kind of knew the theory of it. And everything in me, honestly, if I was like fully outside of the sort of socialization and trauma response, I would have been like, I am not comfortable, certainly in this setting. Could I watch you do this one and you explain
I
it to
see one
me?
first.
Can I see one first, please? And have you be a safe, kind person to explain it to me. And then, we could try next time. But instead I just squeaked out, sure. And then like attempted to put it in. He's like, is it in? I'm like, yeah. I'm sure I said yes.
In
So that's the
somewhere.
thing. From the outside, like you think about who gets labeled. In this case I didn't get labeled, but I could have been labeled sort of like an inauthentic or lying or difficult resident, like a weak resident. Because why did you say yes when you should have said no? Like how sometimes we do this. Like you were called difficult in your situation.
Yeah.
But I was like, yes. And then, inflated the balloon and accidentally tripped the guy. Like it inflated in his prostate, blood came out. It was not good. The urologist was like, he may never be on his own again. It was so, and like, and that as well, right? So no one in the room then stayed with me. I remember the only female in the room gave me a quick pat and like, it's okay. Anyways, moving on. And like, I was frozen. I then had to stand through the
Right. Then you
surgery
have to stay in the room.
with your capital F failure where I mean, like an adverse medical event happened and no one even like debriefed, not even like the basic, like, hey, let's make sure that doesn't happen again. Like even on that level,
let's walk you through the
it
steps
was
of
just
what could have gone
silent.
differently.
It was freezing at a later date. The preceptor was like, on retrospect, maybe that wasn't the right setting. Like he said like one little thing, but otherwise didn't bring it up. So like helpless, like I truly, like my fawn response, which had been conditioned over, my entire life to just always try and do what the teacher says to get the A.
Right.
And especially in this case where I'm like, I feel like I'm catching up. Like and then after like feeling so alone and so unseen and not even believing myself, like my default story was I have to hide how bad of a learner I am. Like my inadequacy, I just have to hide it. I'm going to ask less questions. I'm going to do a better job at trying to read these people to get what I need to do. I'm not going to try catheters again. I honestly think maybe I did one other catheter. I somehow escaped, like
and you're like,
and I don't do them. To be clear, I don't use them in my work now. But like, say I needed to at some point, like I'd be like, someone needs to actually train me on this.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually.
It didn't make me want to learn it at all. Like it was like, I'm gonna pretend. Like I pretended so much when I was supposed to be there to learn. I was supposed to be bad at everything. I was a learner. And none of that as a baseline was there. And then after I was bad at something, if you will, like I did an inadequate job at this thing. There was no, even if the emotional support would have been cool, but even like the learning moment, like it was like so left alone and therefore just deep, deep shame and internalizing that. Versus now I do look back on it and I have so much more empathy for that girl in that room and totally understand why it went the way it went. I even have expanded and have more understanding, at least, of likely, well, that preceptor in the same system. Like I used to have an anger story against him, but it's not serving me. So I don't, and really just like, it's more like, look at this whole thing we're calling education.
Right.
And the opportunities we're missing for learning. Like if people are not sure about if we should stay human, let's at least be effective teachers. And that was not a strong teachable moment for anyone. And so like, that's like what I think. That's why some of the ways I frame things, and I've given presentations on like trauma informed education. The thing that I've learned the most is like, our brains are built to learn. Our brains, and then like whether our IQs are high or not, like we as humans are designed to learn. We can be curious and we can be endlessly capable of learning new skills when our nervous systems feel safe and supported to do so. And so what if the greatest gift you can give yourself is like both the mindsets and the environment and the supports to feel safe and secure so that you can learn, because we are learning and messing up and learning every day on this dang job
Yeah,
forever.
absolutely. All the time.
And then especially the thing I have found that's so beautiful is being in this place where it's like I feel safe with myself. I know how to ground myself and be with myself through hard emotions, that I can now that extend that out. So with my patients, I don't feel like I don't not perfectionistic with them. They don't have to
Yep.
perform well for me.
Yep.
I
Yep. They don't
can
have to
hold
fawn
space.
back to you as the
They don't.
authority figure, right?
Yes, exactly. The connections are so beautiful. And I see people finding their own way towards their
Mhm.
definition of health. And it's beautiful. Like it actually
Yeah.
makes my job rich and rewarding and what I was hoping for to begin with. So
Yeah.
the journey's been rocky. There will, I'm sure, be much more discovery, even like of the impacts of trauma and stuff. But the
Yeah.
other thing that I do is I do teach medical learners, and
Mhm.
I do try and name explicitly some of this stuff and talk
Yeah.
about trauma informed. And I try and be just the safest, most supportive preceptor I can be, because I want to break the cycle. I don't want someone in my presence to feel any kind of way like I felt in that operating room, because I
Yeah.
don't think anyone should have to.
Yeah. And of course to do that, like really in the long term, right, you have to be taking good care of yourself so that
Yes.
you have the resilience and the bandwidth to be able to be a safe place,
Yes.
right? Because of course, part of his story may have been that
Mm,
he was so burned out, and he was overwhelmed and he was experiencing a lot of things. And that blocked him from being able to be aware that you were a learner, that you might not have had the experience that you need, that you might be afraid of him,
absolutely.
right?
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
that realization for me, thinking it back to, some of my attendings who were really harsh and, angry, as you mentioned before, like I've let go of my anger stories about them and my former workplace to a large extent because I've been able to see it through this different lens. And I think you'd agree. It sounds like that part of this benefit of the painful work that we've done to get to this place and learning our emotions and all is that we can let go of those anger stories because we give ourselves permission to feel safe now, to be able to understand that our feelings are not dangerous. They may
Yes.
be difficult, but they're not dangerous.
Yeah.
And to be able to see those humans were probably doing the best that they could.
Mhm.
And that was the result,
Yeah.
right? Also a product of their systems and their training.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's because like it lets the system off the hook if we say it was just those bad apples,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And the thing is, like, that's why I found it really helpful when, like, speaking of coaching, to always like name the systems under which we're operating. Like,
Hmm.
basically, in some, like, to name where we get our unintentional thoughts from, where we get our default stories from. It's like
Yeah.
from the system.
Right.
And it's this interesting, there's a bit of a paradox in it, because, like, the system exists because we all believe it should. And so it is actually up to a whole bunch of individuals to shift our mindsets. And that is then how we change our system, you know? And in the meantime, though, I find it hard to hold a lot of anger towards too many people who are operating, in this collective
Hmm.
mindset that is just
Hmm.
passed around to one another. So
Yeah.
just when we get to individual blame, it's an understandable reaction. And I'll sit in it for a minute. Like, I'll be
Right.
petty and angry and like permission to be pissed for a minute, right?
Yeah.
And I notice that, like, especially when I come back to my human self, I'm able to see the humanity in them, and that it just feels better. And
It
bottom
feels
line,
better now
let's
for
feel
us.
better. Yeah.
For us, because it doesn't feel good either,
Yeah.
to carry those anger stories, to be full of blame and wanting to shame other people.
Yes.
That's a very natural response. It's a protective response, right? But it's not helpful. Trying to think, it's a primitive defense mechanism as opposed to whatever else they call it, can't remember. Um, it's it's not the way that feels good, right? I think for so many of us, right, burnout and overwhelm just makes this world smaller and smaller. And yeah, we've got
Mm,
shame and we've got trauma, like we've got all these things kind of piled on top, and we just want to retreat by ourselves alone.
mhm.
And that it doesn't feel good to be there. It doesn't feel good to need to protect yourself that way. Life is not good there.
No.
And my perspective, and it sounds like you share, right, is we're not going to wait until the system
Yeah.
is fixed. We're not going to let everybody off the hook as though they have no responsibility, but we're really helping people to realize how much control they have, that their feelings are safe, that, they can be a human, right? They
Yes.
can reconnect with those parts of themselves, and life feels much better there,
Yes.
right? And we can be human again
We
in the
can.
room,
Yes.
in any
And
room.
and really like and truly then as we feel better. And I like that. Speaking of metrics, that's a core one, if not, it's not the only one, I suppose, but it's a big one of like, is this plan or is this way of being making me feel better? Am I able to
Mm,
feel
mhm,
and feel better, not like maybe just like superficially like distract me from sadness, but like feel better as in feel all of my feelings,
mhm.
but feel
Right.
connected to myself, at home with myself, which ultimately just also means literally I feel like more pleasure, I feel more satisfaction, I have more
Mhm.
capacity for joy because I am staying with myself. When I am there, I am changing the system because, like I said, I'm at
Right.
least changing my local ecosystem, my
Right.
patients that I interact with, my staff that I
Right.
interact with, that has ripple effects. And I then also have the bandwidth to say, do what I've noticed absolutely is like some of my work in the world. Sounds like for you, like the coaching stuff is like holding space for others to find their way back to themselves and reconnect
Mhm.
with themselves.
Yeah.
That is another way that I think we both are shifting and changing the system in like in genuine, tangible ways.
Yeah.
And if enough of us do it, then there's not anyone left for them to bully anyway. Then we can all be like literally all be like, cool on the A1C. I'm gonna go
Yeah.
back and
Yeah.
work at 75% of my capacity. Oh, you say
Yep.
I have to work more than that? Interesting. And like it's not that I have no levers, but like frankly, say like all clinicians were like, we're all only gonna work 75% of our capacities.
Yeah.
Figure it out. Like
Right.
they
You
would
guys
have
do the
to.
math. It's not a surprise that patients walk into the clinic sometimes. It's not a surprise
Yes.
that patients call the clinic every day, or there's heart attack, any
Yes.
of the things. Like, it's not a surprise.
No.
Why do we treat it like a surprise?
Yeah.
Let's be smarter. That, yeah.
Let's be smarter. I love
Be
that.
smarter about how this rolls. Oh,
Totally.
yes. Oh, um, this has been a really lovely conversation. I feel like we can probably keep going for a long time, but we
I'm
should
sure we can.
probably not. I usually wrap up my show by asking someone who, is experiencing some of what we've talked about today, who feels really like they're struggling, like what would you want them to hear right now? If you think about, kind of you being in a tough place,
Yeah.
what do you wish somebody would have said to you?
I think like one thing is everything that you're feeling makes total sense.
Mhm.
You make sense as a person and you are not the problem. Yes, that you have great capacity to change your life and do amazing things, and that's beautiful. But even just like right now in this moment, like
Yeah. You are not the
you
problem.
are not the
You are
problem.
not broken.
No, I think that's like I have so many people like they're like, oh, I have imposter syndrome, I have perfectionism, and like there's all these different ways of saying I'm broken, I'm the problem. And now I've got to fix my perfectionism. Like
Right.
it's sort of,
Right.
you know
Now
what
I
I
need a
mean?
cure. Need
Yeah, and it's
pill.
like no, like those are the scars and marks of this world that doesn't want you to be your authentic human self.
Yes.
You can come back home to yourself, and it is so not your fault. It's not your fault that you are where you are, and you have the power to change. It's like those two things at the
Yeah.
same time.
Yeah. It is the
What I love.
consequence of the training, just like the debt and
Oh, that's so
yes.
yes.
Just like any number of other costs associated with doing this work. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually plays well off of like my last question I usually ask is like, what is keeping you human in healthcare now? So yeah, like what have you been noticing, both keeping you human through coaching and in your work in healthcare?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it has been letting go of this notion that I control
Mm,
things, and reminding myself, sometimes better than others, that I'm not responsible for most of the things that
yeah.
occur with my patients. And I'm also not responsible for most of the things that happen to them and their experiences in healthcare. What I can be is a human, and I'm better when I am a human in the room, having a human connection with someone, listening to their story, and helping to figure out what do we need to do, or what validation does this person need, or what are they afraid of, to try and figure out some kind of plan. And that feels so much better. I don't know if you've experienced this. I feel like I've got, kind of a big handful of patients with, kind of unexplained situations, like long COVID, like everyone's
Yes.
got POTS and long COVID and, all these kind of, unexplained physical symptoms and mental symptoms. And sometimes, after we've done tests and we've done things, just having those human moments and sitting with them and acknowledging that what they're experiencing is real, that it sucks, that I can't explain it, that it's really hard to have an ununderstood medical condition that we don't have a great label for,
Yeah.
and that there might not be other medical things that will help them.
Mm,
And when I come to those conversations as a human, I feel better. They feel better.
yeah.
Right. And we're just people
Mm,
listening to each other, supporting each other, um, trying to move through this world, hopefully with some grace and some self-kindness and compassion. And that's really satisfying. Whereas before, it was all about, I have to fix everything.
yep.
I have to fix this medical thing. I have to fix the consultant who was rude to you. I have to, the lab slip that got left behind, the appointment I have to fix that you have chest pain and you're coming into the clinic when you should be in the emergency room. Right.
Yep.
Right. I felt like I owned all of that.
Mm,
And I'm, having to realize, right, I'm not a bad doctor
yeah.
for putting down those responsibilities and meeting the situation where I am and where they are.
Mm-hmm.
But the chest pain in the clinic always gets me. Just like, you're not supposed to be
Oh
here.
no. Why are you here, man?
Tell you what, we're going to go to the emergency room.
Some ways it's the easiest decision to make all day, though. You're like, well,
Sometimes, yeah. Like,
great
how
news.
sick are you? Oh, pretty
Yeah,
sick.
yeah. I actually have an answer for you, and it's leave this place.
It's not here. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, and then I guess like we'll share. So obviously, um, you can say the name of your podcast again, but then beyond that, like if folks are interested in working with you or learning more from you, where would they find your stuff
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
internet?
So my podcast is Ending Physician Overwhelm, and some of our listeners will be listening to it on my side, and then we'll send them to yours as well. My coaching practice is called Healthier for Good. And so it's www.healthierforgood.com. And you can find out more about one-on-one coaching. And then I also run a program for women physicians based on Brene Brown's work. And that program runs it's about a 3-month program. And we start up again September 10th. And so I'm excited to get going again. And tell my listeners where they can find you and listen to your podcast and find out more about working with you.
Yes. Well, yes, the name of my podcast is The Other Human in the Room. And that's you, clinician, you're the other human in the room. My stuff is at joanchanmd.com. And then I'm on like Instagram at joanchanmd, and the same handle on like, I'm technically a little bit on TikTok. My handle still exists on Twitter/X or whatever it's called, but I
But
couldn't.
we don't do that anymore.
It's scary in there. I don't know what Mr. Musk is doing over there. So, but the main place I hang out really is Instagram if you want to watch/read from me. Yeah, and so I do one-on-one coaching, as well as I've just started my first group program that's focused on connection called Interconnected, and it's folks in healthcare who want to practice connection with each other, with ourselves, with patients, and in community. So that's what I've got going on.
Lovely. Well, I'm so glad that we got a chance to sit and talk, and now we can be internet friends for real.
Yes.
Such a weird world. That is one good thing about the pandemic, is I've never met so many people virtually and
Yes,
become friends. Like, it's awesome. So thank you again for making the time. And I'm so excited for both of our listeners to hear the conversation and get a chance to learn a little bit more about kind of where we see things now, right, from our perspective, because life feels better here,
yes,
right? And even if people aren't doing the work that we're doing coaching others, they can benefit and see that when we do this difficult work, right, when we kind of pick our head up out of the sand, right, and no longer kind of, actively self-protecting, that we can feel better. We can feel better, and we can feel our emotions better, and eventually let go of some of the anger stories, right? And the
yeah.
blame.
Amen. I think that's what both our missions are all about, and I love what you're doing, because this is how we do it. This is how we change the system. So it
Yeah.
was such a
Yeah.
pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.